The word reached him before the woman did. Theodore Sterling, 5th Duke of Halford, had not intended to be standing behind the silk screen at the Countess of Ashwick's summer ball. He had intended to be in the card room, where Lord Pemberton owed him a conversation about drainage rights along the eastern boundary, and where the champagne was tolerable and the company did not require him to dance. But Pemberton had not arrived. The card room smelled of pipe smoke and ambition, and Theodore had stepped through a side door into the narrow corridor behind the ballroom's eastern wall to find a glass of something cold and a moment of silence. What he found instead were 3 women speaking about a 4th as though she were furniture. "She is entirely without value," said a voice he would later learn belonged to Lady Drummond, whose vowels carried the particular sharpness of a woman who had married well enough to believe her opinions constituted fact. "I told my brother before he died. The girl will amount to nothing. No beauty, no portion, no connection worth mentioning. She is here because I could not leave her at home without the servants talking." "And yet, she is out," said another, younger, with the breathless register of someone trying very hard to sound bored. "In a gown that I believe belonged to your parlor maid. It belonged to Louisa 2 seasons ago. I had it taken in. The girl ought to be grateful. She would have nothing if not for my generosity. Nothing at all." Theodore set his glass down on the windowsill. "She will not find a husband here or anywhere else," Lady Drummond continued. "I have told her as much. She is to accompany Louisa and remain pleasant and forgettable, and when the season is over, she will return to the cottage in Shropshire where she belongs. If she manages not to embarrass us before then, I shall consider my obligation to my brother's memory fulfilled." There was laughter. Light, practiced, perfectly calibrated to wound anyone who might overhear, which, Theodore supposed, was precisely the point. He did not know the girl they were discussing. He did not know her name, her face, or whether she was indeed without beauty or portion or any of the things Lady Drummond had catalogued with such surgical pleasure. What he knew was that the voice behind the screen had spoken the word worthless with the same casual ease one might use to describe a horse past its best years, and that something in the center of his chest had tightened in a way he had not felt since the morning they had lowered his mother's coffin into the ground at Halford. He walked back into the ballroom. It took him 4 minutes to identify her, not because she was difficult to find. Lady Drummond had been accurate about one thing. The girl was not the sort who commanded attention when she entered a room, but because he had to locate Louisa Drummond first, and then look for whoever was standing near her in a gown that did not quite fit, and an expression that suggested she knew it. She was at the edge of the room, near the second pillar from the doors, holding a glass of lemonade she had not touched. Her hair was dark and simply dressed, without the pearls or flowers that studded every other head in the room. Her gown was pale muslin, cut in last season's style, and taken in at the bodice with stitches that were competent but visible if one looked closely enough, which Theodore did. She was watching the dancers with an expression he recognized, not longing, not envy, but the particular careful stillness of a person who has learned that if she makes herself small enough, she will not be spoken about. She had not yet learned that they spoke about her anyway. Theodore crossed the ballroom floor. He was aware that people noticed. He was the Duke of Halford, unmarried, 31, possessed of 12,000 acres in Hertfordshire, and a house in Grosvenor Square, and a seat in the House of Lords that he attended with the regularity of a man who believed governance was not a hobby. When he crossed a ballroom floor with purpose, people watched. He stopped in front of the girl in the ill-fitting gown. "I do not believe we have been introduced," he said. "I am Halford." She looked up at him. Her eyes were gray, and there was a quality in them that he had not expected. Not surprise exactly, but something closer to assessment. She was deciding, in the space between his greeting and her response, whether this was a cruelty or a kindness, and she was not going to assume either until she had evidence. "Miss Lennox," she said. "Harriet Lennox." "Miss Lennox," he inclined his head, "would you do me the honor of the next dance?" She did not answer immediately. Her gaze moved, briefly, involuntarily, to the place where Lady Drummond stood with Louisa and 2 other women whose names Theodore had not yet troubled himself to learn. Lady Drummond's face had gone very still. "Your Grace," Harriet said quietly, "I think perhaps you have mistaken me for my cousin." "I have not." "Louisa is there by the window. She would be very pleased to—" Miss Lennox." He kept his voice level, but he did not soften it. He wanted her to hear that he meant it. "I have asked you, not your cousin. Will you dance with me?" The gray eyes came back to his. She searched his face for something, mockery perhaps, or pity, and appeared not to find it. What she found instead, he could not have said, but something shifted in the set of her shoulders. She straightened, not dramatically, not defiantly, but in the way of a woman remembering that she had a spine and that it was hers to use. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, I will." He offered her his hand. She took it. They danced a cotillion. She danced well, not with the practiced brilliance of a girl who had been tutored in every step since childhood, but with the natural musicality of someone who listened to the rhythm and trusted her feet to follow. She did not chatter during the figures. She did not attempt to flatter him or to fill the silences with the desperate brightness that so many young women deployed when confronted with a duke. She simply danced, and when the figure brought them close enough to speak, she said, "You are a very deliberate man, Your Grace." It was not a question, and it was not a compliment. It was an observation, delivered with a precision that made him look at her again. "I am," he said. "Does that trouble you?" "It depends," she said, "on what you are being deliberate about." The dance ended. He returned her to the edge of the room, bowed, and walked away. He felt Lady Drummond's gaze on his back like a hand pressed between his shoulder blades. He left the ball within the hour. In the carriage, he sat in the dark and considered what he had just done and why. The girl, Miss Lennox, had been precisely what Lady Drummond had described, without fortune, without connection, without the sort of face that painters begged to capture. She was not beautiful in the way London understood beauty. She was something else. She was the kind of woman who, when told she was worthless, did not weep or rage, but simply stood very still and held her glass of lemonade and watched the dancers with gray eyes that saw everything and expected nothing. Theodore had buried his mother at 19. He had inherited the dukedom at 22 from an uncle who had treated Halford as a source of income rather than a responsibility. He had spent 9 years repairing land, rebuilding tenancies, sitting through interminable sessions in the House of Lords, arguing about corn laws with men who had never touched a stalk of wheat. He had done all of this alone because the world had taught him early that help was not coming and that the only reliable form of power was the kind you built yourself, brick by brick, in silence. He recognized that lesson in the set of Harriet Lennox's shoulders. He called on the Countess of Ashwick the following afternoon, ostensibly to thank her for the ball, but in truth to learn the particulars of Miss Lennox's situation. The Countess, who was 63 and had survived 4 decades in society by knowing everything about everyone, was happy to oblige. Harriet Lennox was the only child of the late Mr. George Lennox, Lady Drummond's younger brother, who had been a clergyman in Shropshire with a living worth perhaps £200 a year. He had died 4 years ago of a fever that had also taken his wife within the same fortnight. Harriet had been 20. There had been no money, no property, nothing except a small cottage that belonged to Lady Drummond and was offered, the Countess used the word offered, with a delicate emphasis that conveyed everything about the conditions attached, on the understanding that Harriet would be useful. Useful meant accompanying Louisa through the season, carrying Louisa's fan, holding Louisa's shawl, standing near Louisa so that Louisa's complexion appeared to greater advantage, being, in every visible particular, less. "The girl bears it with extraordinary grace," the Countess said, pouring him a second cup of tea. "I have watched her for 2 seasons now. She never complains. She never draws attention. She simply endures." "She should not have to endure," Theodore said. The Countess looked at him over the rim of her cup with the expression of a woman who had just heard exactly what she expected to hear. He arranged to be at the same engagements. This was not difficult. The season compressed 500 families into the same 30 drawing rooms, and a duke could secure an invitation to anything simply by expressing mild interest. He saw her at Lady Chiswick's musical evening, where she sat at the back and listened to a mediocre soprano with more attention than the performance deserved. He saw her at the Dalrymple garden party, where she stood beneath a copper beech tree reading a book she had concealed inside a folded program. At the garden party, he approached her. "What are you reading?" She startled, not dramatically, but with the small flinch of someone unaccustomed to being noticed. She looked down at the book, then up at him, and for a moment he thought she might lie. Herodotus, she said. In translation, I'm afraid. My Greek is not what it should be. Whose is, he said. She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the architecture of one, the preliminary structure before the thing itself was built. But it changed her face entirely. For the first time, Theodore saw what Lady Drummond's cruelty had been designed to conceal, that Harriet Lennox, given space and light and the absence of someone telling her she was nothing, was a woman of considerable presence. The Countess tells me you have read a great deal, he said. The Countess is kind. I have read what was available to me, which in Shropshire was whatever my father's library contained. He had Catholic tastes and a bookseller in Shrewsbury who extended him more credit than was wise. And what did you learn? She looked at him with those gray, assessing eyes. That the world is larger than Shropshire, she said, and that knowing that is both a gift and a punishment. They walked together for 20 minutes. She spoke about Herodotus and about the particular cruelty of the Persian court and about whether history was better understood as a series of decisions made by powerful men or as the slow accumulation of forces that no single person could control. She spoke well, not with the rehearsed polish of a woman performing intelligence for an audience, but with the unguarded fluency of someone who had been thinking about these things alone for a very long time and had finally found someone who might listen. Theodore listened. He was good at listening. It was a skill he had developed in the House of Lords, where the men who spoke least often spoke best, and it had served him well in estate management, where a tenant who felt heard was a tenant who stayed. But he was not listening the way he listened to debates about tariff reform. He was listening the way he had once listened to his mother read aloud in the library at Halford on winter evenings when the fire was low and the world outside the windows was nothing but darkness and wind. He was listening with the part of himself that he had shut away when they lowered her coffin, and he had understood, at 19, that tenderness was a luxury he could not afford. Lady Drummond noticed. Of course she noticed. She was a woman whose entire existence was organized around the management of appearances, and the appearance of the Duke of Halford walking through a garden party with her charity case of a niece was not something she could permit. She intercepted Harriet that evening. Theodore learned this later from the Countess, who had learned it from Lady Chiswick's lady's maid, who had overheard it through a dressing-room wall. Lady Drummond had told Harriet that she was making a fool of herself, that the Duke was amusing himself at her expense, that men like Halford did not marry girls like Harriet Lennox. They entertained themselves with them for a season and then returned to the business of finding a wife with a dowry and a family worth marrying into. She had told Harriet that if she continued to put herself forward, Lady Drummond would withdraw her support entirely, and the cottage in Shropshire would no longer be available, and Harriet would discover what it truly meant to have nothing. Harriet did not argue. She did not defend herself. She curtsied and said, "Yes, Aunt," and went to her room, and the following morning she did not appear at breakfast, and she did not appear at the afternoon call, and she did not appear at the evening assembly. Theodore noticed her absence the way one notices the removal of a painting from a wall, not immediately, but with a growing sense that something was wrong with the proportions of the room. He called on Lady Drummond. The visit was brief, and it was not pleasant. Theodore was not a man given to speeches, but he was a man who understood power and who understood, with absolute clarity, the difference between wielding it and hiding behind it. He sat in Lady Drummond's drawing room, and he told her, in the measured tone of a man who had not raised his voice since the day he inherited the dukedom, that he intended to call upon her niece the following afternoon, and that if any obstacle were placed in his way, he would ensure that Lady Drummond's place in society, which rested, as they both knew, not on her own merits but on the memory of a husband whose family tolerated her, became considerably less comfortable. Lady Drummond's face went through several colors. She said nothing. Theodore stood, bowed, and left. He called the following afternoon. Harriet received him in a small sitting room at the back of the house, a room clearly designated for the household's least important occupant. It had one window, a writing desk with a broken hinge, and a chair whose upholstery was worn to threads. Her gown was the same pale muslin from the ball, and she had not dressed her hair with any particular care, and she looked at him when he entered with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but something between the two that made his chest tighten again in that way he had only ever associated with loss. "You should not have come," she said. "Why not?" "Because my aunt will make me pay for it, and you will go back to Grosvenor Square, and I will still be here." He sat down without being invited. This was, he was aware, a breach of etiquette so fundamental that it would have horrified his mother, but his mother had also taught him that there were moments when propriety mattered less than presence, and this was one of them. "Miss Lennox," he said, "I would like to tell you something, and I would like you to listen without interrupting, because I am not a man who finds these things easy to say, and I am unlikely to say them well." She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. "I overheard your aunt at the Ashwick ball," he said. "Before we danced, she called you worthless. She said you would amount to nothing. She said you were there on sufferance and that you ought to be grateful." He paused. "I have thought about very little else since that evening." Harriet's hands tightened in her lap, but her face did not change. "I did not ask you to dance because I pitied you. I asked you to dance because a woman who is spoken about in that way, who stands in a ballroom holding a glass she has not touched and watches the world with eyes that see everything and expect nothing, that woman is not worthless. That woman is the most interesting person in the room, and I have spent 9 years in rooms full of people who are considered valuable by every measure society applies, and I can tell you with certainty that the measure is wrong." She said nothing. Her eyes were very bright. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, with your aunt's knowledge, which I have already ensured, and with whatever chaperone you consider appropriate. I am not amusing myself at your expense. I do not do things for amusement. I do things because I have decided they are worth doing, and I have decided that you are worth knowing, and I would very much like the opportunity to discover whether I am right." The silence in the small sitting room with the broken desk and the threadbare chair lasted for what felt like a very long time. "You are a very deliberate man," she said for the second time. "I am. And you have decided this." "I have." She looked at her hands. She looked at the window. She looked back at him. The architecture of the smile he had seen at the garden party completed itself. Not a wide smile, not a brilliant one, but a real one, quiet and certain, the kind of smile that a woman offers when she has been told she is nothing. For so long that being seen feels like stepping into sunlight after years in a darkened room. "Then I will not refuse you," she said, "but I should tell you. I have no dowry, no connections, nothing to offer a duke except a thorough acquaintance with Herodotus and a tolerance for silence. Those," Theodore said, "are precisely the qualifications I have been looking for." The courtship lasted 6 weeks. They were seen together at dinners, at the opera, at a lecture on Roman aqueducts, at the Royal Institution, where Harriet asked the lecturer a question about water pressure that the man could not answer, and Theodore sat beside her, feeling something that he identified, with some difficulty, as pride. He took her driving in Hyde Park on a Thursday morning, in an open barouche, so that all of London could see and draw its own conclusions. She wore a Spencer jacket in dark blue, her own, not Louise's, and a bonnet that she had retrimmed herself with ribbon from a haberdasher in a street that duchesses did not frequent. She looked out at the park and at the riders and the promenading families, and she said, "They are all watching us." "They are. Does it trouble you?" "Not in the slightest." She turned to look at him. The wind had loosened a strand of dark hair from beneath her bonnet, and she did not push it back, and he understood in that moment that she was not performing ease. She was experiencing it, perhaps for the first time in years, the simple comfort of being beside someone who did not require her to earn her place. At Lady Mercer's dinner the following week, she was seated beside the Earl of Whitmore, a man of considerable intellect and negligible charm, who spent the first 2 courses attempting to determine whether the Duke's interest in Miss Lennox was sincere or strategic. Theodore watched from across the table as Harriet navigated the interrogation with the same patient composure she brought to everything, answering fully when the questions were genuine, deflecting gracefully when they were not, and at one point making the Earl laugh so suddenly that he choked on his claret. After dinner, Whitmore sought Theodore in the drawing room and said simply, "She is remarkable." "I am aware," Theodore said. "No," Whitmore said. "I do not think you are fully aware yet. But you will be." He was right. London talked. London always talked. The consensus was divided. Half of society believed the Duke had lost his mind, and the other half believed he was making a point about something, land reform perhaps, or the insufficiency of the marriage market, and that the girl was a means to an end rather than the end itself. A third, smaller faction, consisting primarily of the Countess of Ashwick and Lord Whitmore, and 2 or 3 others who had taken the trouble to actually speak with Harriet, held the view that the Duke was doing the most sensible thing he had done in 9 years, and that London would catch up eventually. Lady Drummond, who had been given no choice but to present the courtship as her own doing, performed the role with the rigid smile of a woman swallowing glass. Louisa, to her credit, was kind about it, or at least not actively unkind, which was more than anyone expected, and which Harriet received with a quiet gratitude that she expressed not in words but in the way she continued to hold Louisa's shawl at evening events, even though she no longer needed to. Theodore proposed on a Tuesday afternoon in the library at Grosvenor Square. He had considered the garden or a carriage ride through Hyde Park, or some suitably dramatic setting that the Ton would have approved of. But the library was where he was most himself, surrounded by the books his mother had collected and the ledgers from Halford and the drafts of speeches he was preparing for the Lords, and he wanted Harriet to see him clearly before she answered. She was examining a shelf of natural philosophy volumes when he said her name. She turned. He did not kneel. He was holding a cup of tea, and it seemed impractical, but he stood very straight and said, "Harriet, I would like to marry you. I'm asking because I cannot imagine Halford without you in it, and I have tried, and the attempt makes me unhappy. Will you have me?" She set down the volume of Linnaeus she had been holding. "You are proposing to me while holding a teacup." "I am. Is that deliberate?" "Everything I do is deliberate. You know this about me." She crossed the room. She took the teacup from his hand and set it on the nearest shelf between a volume of Gibbon and a stack of estate correspondence. Then she put her hands on either side of his face. Her fingers were cold from the unheated library, and she kissed him once with the same quiet precision with which she did everything. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." They married in the chapel at Halford 3 weeks later. It was a small wedding. The Countess of Ashwick, who wept openly, Lord Pemberton, who served as witness and later admitted he had been more moved than he expected, the household staff assembled in the pews with the formality and barely suppressed emotion of people who had watched their master be alone for 9 years and had given up hoping. Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, pressed Harriet's hands between her own at the wedding breakfast and said, "We have been waiting for you, Your Grace, though we did not know it." Lady Drummond attended. She sat in the third pew and smiled the smile of a woman calculating the social value of having a niece who was now a duchess against the humiliation of having been wrong about her. The calculation appeared to come out in favor of attendance, if not warmth. Louisa stood beside Harriet as she dressed that morning and fastened the pearl buttons at her wrists and said quietly, "I am glad it is you." Harriet looked at her cousin in the mirror and saw, for the first time, not the beautiful girl she'd been employed to make more beautiful by comparison, but a young woman who had been given everything except the freedom to be ordinary. She took Louisa's hand and held it, and nothing more needed to be said. Halford opened itself to Harriet the way a house opens to someone who belongs in it, not all at once, but room by room, corridor by corridor, with the slow unfolding intimacy of a place revealing its secrets to someone it trusts. She learned the particular creak of the third stair. She learned that the morning light in the East Gallery turned the portraits gold. She learned that Becket, the steward, had managed the estate with meticulous competence for 9 years and was desperately relieved to have someone else to show the account books to. She did not attempt to change things. She asked questions. She listened. She sat with Mrs. Graves in the housekeeper's parlor and drank tea and learned the rhythms of the household, which tenant's wife was expecting, which roof needed rethatching before autumn, which of the kitchen maids was walking out with the under-gardener, and whether it was likely to end well. She oversaw the domestic accounts through the steward with the same careful attention she had once given to Herodotus, and within 3 months the household operated with a fluency it had not possessed since Theodore's mother's time. Theodore watched this happen with the bewildered gratitude of a man who had not known what he was missing until it arrived. He came home from the House of Lords to find her in the library with Becket's quarterly report spread across the desk and a pencil behind her ear, and something in him that had been clenched for a decade finally, slowly, let go. There was a particular evening in October that he would remember afterwards as the moment he understood what his life had become. He had returned from London late after a session in the Lords that had run long on a question of poor relief that no one in the chamber appeared to have thought about with any rigor. He was tired and irritable, and the carriage had been cold. He walked into the entrance hall expecting silence and darkness. Instead, he found light, candles in the hallway, a fire in the library. Harriet at his desk, not her own, his, the one he had used for 9 years, with a letter from one of the tenant farmers spread in front of her and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her elbow. She looked up when he came in, and her expression was not the bright, performed welcome of a wife greeting her husband for the benefit of the servants. It was the distracted half-smile of a woman who had been deeply absorbed in something and was pleased to see him, but would also like to finish her thought. "Beckett tells me the Hargrove family's roof is worse than we supposed," she said. "I have been looking at the accounts. If we delay the fence repair on the south pasture until spring, there's enough to rethatch before the first frost." He sat down across from her. "You have been looking at the accounts." "I have been looking at the accounts. And you have found a solution that Beckett did not." Beckett found the same solution. He was simply too polite to suggest moving your fence money. She looked at him with that gray, steady gaze. "I'm not too polite. The Hargroves have 3 children under 6. They cannot winter under a failing roof." He stared at her for a long moment, this woman in his library, in his chair, solving his problems with the quiet competence of someone who had spent her entire life being told she was nothing and had decided, without announcement or fanfare, to be everything. "Move the fence money," he said. She nodded, made a note in the margin of the accounts, and went back to her reading. He told her about his mother that winter. He had not told anyone about his mother, not Pemberton, not the Countess, not any of the women who had been paraded before him at balls for 9 seasons. They were sitting by the fire in the library after dinner, and Harriet was reading, and Theodore was not reading but watching the firelight move across the spines of the books on the shelf opposite. His mother's shelf, the one he had never reorganized because the order of the volumes was the last arrangement her hands had made, and he said, without planning to, "She would have liked you." Harriet looked up. She did not ask who. She waited. He told her about the winter evenings by the fire and the books she had read aloud and the way she had known the name of every tenant's child on the estate and how he had stood at her grave at 19 and made himself into stone because stone does not break. He told her about the years after, the inheritance, the uncle's debts, the long, slow work of rebuilding a place that someone else had nearly ruined, and how he had done all of it alone because he did not know how to ask for help and because asking for help required admitting that he needed it, and admitting need had felt for a very long time like admitting weakness. Harriet listened. She did not say she understood because she was not a woman who claimed understanding she had not earned. She closed her book and set it aside and moved to sit beside him, and she put her hand on his and she sat with him in the silence. And that was enough. It was, he thought, more than enough. It was the first time in 9 years that he had been in a room with another person and felt not less alone but entirely unalone, which was a different thing, and which mattered more than he had words for. Their first child was born the following spring, a daughter whom they named Frances after Theodore's mother. The Countess of Ashwick arrived at Halford within 2 days of the birth, bearing an impractical amount of French lace and an expression of satisfaction so profound it bordered on smugness. "I knew," she said, holding the baby with the practiced confidence of a woman who had outlived 3 husbands and numerous godchildren. "I knew at the Ashwick ball. When you crossed that floor, I turned to Lady Chiswick and I said, 'That man has just seen the rest of his life, and he does not yet know it.'" Theodore, standing in the doorway of the bedchamber watching his wife and his daughter and the Countess who had made it her business to know everything about everyone, thought that she had been right. A son followed 2 years later, Thomas. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's temperament, serious, watchful, deliberate in a way that made the nursemaids laugh, and Theodore recognized himself with a clarity that was both unsettling and deeply satisfying. Lady Drummond visited Halford once in the 2nd year. She walked through the house and the grounds, and she saw what Harriet had built, not through transformation, but through attention, through the patient work of a woman who had learned that care was a form of power, and that the quietest kind of strength was the kind that lasted. She stayed for 2 nights. At breakfast on the second morning, she said, "You have done well, Harriet." It was the first time she had used her niece's Christian name without it sounding like a concession. Harriet poured her aunt a cup of tea and said, "Thank you, Aunt." And then, because she was Harriet and because she had spent 4 years in a cottage in Shropshire being told she was nothing, she added very gently, "The tea service belonged to Theodore's mother. She chose it herself. She had extraordinary taste." Lady Drummond looked at the teacup. She looked at Harriet. She drank her tea in silence. She did not visit again. She was not unwelcome, Harriet made that clear, but she did not come. She remained in London for 2 more seasons, and then she retired to Bath, where the society was gentler and the memories were fewer. Louisa married a baronet's son from Hampshire who adored her and who, by all accounts, had never once in his life called anyone worthless. On an evening in September, 4 years after the Ashwick ball, Theodore found Harriet in the library. She was reading, she was always reading, and Frances was asleep in the nursery, and Thomas was being walked through the garden by his nurse, and the house was quiet. In the way that only a house full of people can be quiet, with the particular hum of a place that is being lived in and loved. He sat down beside her. She leaned into him without looking up from her book, an unconscious gesture that she had developed over the years and that still, every time, made him aware of how close he had come to missing this. "I would like to tell you something," he said. She closed her book. She turned to him. She waited, the way she had waited in the small sitting room with the broken desk, with her hands folded and her gray eyes steady. "You're the least worthless person I have ever known," he said, "and I'm grateful every day that I was standing behind that screen." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, the full, completed version of the smile he had first seen at the garden party, the one that changed her face entirely. And she said, "You were not standing behind the screen, you were hiding from Lord Pemberton." "I was avoiding Lord Pemberton. There is a distinction." "There is not." He laughed. It was a sound that Mrs. Graves, passing in the corridor outside, stopped to listen to, because she had worked at Halford for 22 years, and she could count on one hand the number of times she had heard the Duke laugh. The fire burned low. The book lay closed between them. Outside, the Hertfordshire evening settled over the parkland like a hand laid gently on a sleeping child, and inside the library at Halford, the Duke and the Duchess sat together in the quiet, which was not empty but full of years, full of the steady accumulation of small moments that, taken together, constituted a life. If this story stayed with you, you might find the next one does too. They arrive here, like a hand extended across a crowded room whenever they are ready.